In the last lecture module, we explored an answer to what is philosophy by looking at an answer to a particular question relating to Russell's conception of philosophy, namely, what are the goals of philosophy? In this module, we want to look at a second question that also helps us to understand his conception of philosophy. We want to look at and try to answer the question, how does philosophic inquiry relate to everyday practical concerns? And just as before, we want to try and look at what Russell has to say and extract out from particular quotations and from the article overall what we think Russell's answer to that question might be. So let's start by looking at a couple of quotations from the article here. And I'll be careful because Russell uses sexist language here, male-biased language. And so I'll try to read the quotations, but edit them as I'm going through them to get rid of that sexist slant that's basically a background to the intellectual atmosphere of his time. So on page 154, spilling over to 155, Russell says the following. If you ask a mathematician, a mineralogist, a historian, or any other person of learning, what definite body of truths have been ascertained by their science, their answer will last as long as you're willing to listen. But if you put the same question to a philosopher, he or she will, if they're candid, have to confess that their study has not achieved positive results such as been achieved by other sciences. So there's one quotation. Let's look at one more quotation before we try and think about Russell's answer to that second question. So again, on 154, Russell tells us the following. If we are not to fail in our endeavor to determine the value of philosophy, we must first free our minds from the prejudices of what are wrongly called practical people. The practical person, as this word is often used, is one who recognizes only material needs, who realizes that human beings must have food for the body, but is oblivious to the necessity of providing food for the mind. So, just like in the last module, you might want to pause the video for a minute, think about these quotations, about the article overall, and think about how you think Russell actually answers that second question. So, how might Russell answer the second question? What does Russell think he should say in response to the question, how does philosophy relate to practical concerns in everyday life? And again, I think there are really 2 points to be made, 2 comparisons that we find in these quotations. Russell explicitly says several times in the article and in the quotation that we read that philosophy doesn't necessarily create a body of definite knowledge. Now, he doesn't say that philosophy never creates any definite knowledge. He says, in fact, sometimes philosophy succeeds in its goals. However, he says he thinks that people don't realize that philosophy actually does achieve definite knowledge because more often than not, when a definite answer to a philosophic question has been found, then that question or that answer helps to shift the intellectual inquiry over into a new field. It's taken out of philosophy and put somewhere else. And therefore, philosophy doesn't sort of get credit for this definite knowledge that it did create. But he's also very explicit that many philosophic questions have no definite answer. And so we want to keep that in mind, and we want to think about that as part of the answer here. And I think this helps us to understand the way that he's contrasting philosophy, the way that he's placing philosophy against the background of the important influences of his time. So remember when we talked about the historical period in which he was living and writing, what we discovered was that it was shaped very dramatically by this explosion in biology and chemistry and physics, in the sciences. And so I think here Russell is contrasting philosophy with other intellectual fields, particularly fields that he characterizes as sciences. So he wants to say, look, the sciences are generating all this definite knowledge. They are generating determinate facts. Philosophy sometimes does that. It aims for that, but it doesn't always do that. It is different from the sciences in this way. So he's contrasting philosophy with the other forms of intellectual inquiry that have shaped his time. The second thing I think that we need to consider in figuring out how Russell might answer this question is his discussion about the nourishment of the mind. So he says, look, philosophy doesn't create gadgets. It doesn't put food on the table. But he wants to say it still provides a necessary nourishment, a nourishment for the mind. It creates, as he says, food for the mind. And so here I think he's contrasting philosophy with the sort of materialistic practical concerns that we associate with industry and the Industrial Revolution, the other big sweeping change that shaped the historical period in which he lived and worked. So he wants to say, look, philosophy doesn't create gadgets. It doesn't put bread on the table. Philosophers, as they say, bake no bread. But philosophers nevertheless provide an important nourishment for human beings. They provide nourishment for the mind. They feed our sense of wonder, our desire for inquiry, our understanding of the limitations of our own knowledge and beliefs. And so I think this contrast with industry, with practical applications of knowledge, and with science, with theoretical knowledge, is very purposeful. And it's shaped by the sorts of forces that shaped the historical period in which Russell lived and wrote. In the next module, we're going to turn our attention to the question, what is the value of philosophy? And we'll proceed in the same way that we have in answering questions related to Russell's conception of philosophy.